Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to the Ipsos ESG webinar. Today we have a team of our global experts. We have Sally Braidwood, who's the head of corporate reputation based in Australia. We have Jane Latimore, who is the head of our strategic business, which is the market strategy understanding business. And she's based in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, and we have Kiranjit Singh, who leads our strategic consulting business, again based out of Kuala Lumpur. And our experts today will help us make a lot more sense of the alphabet soup that we are in with respect to ESG. So as we move on, we know that ESG is becoming an increasingly critical kind of factor in many of our many of the companies in terms of the the strategic priorities and also the financial and operational decision making. And this is true for Ipsos as well, and even for our clients. At Ipsos, we run this global programs, self-funded studies to understand, initiatives, the information around ESG. And one of the recent studies we did find out from the consumers that they found waste, which is plastic and so on, to be a big environmental concern. It was very top of mind. And this is where Ipsos makes a big differentiation when it comes to ESG, because a lot of companies talk about ESG, and I'm sure you have been bombarded with ESG conversations in the last 6 months or 1 year, 2 years. But there's a difference in which we do what we do. We not only understand consumers, society, and also the markets in around 80 countries globally, but we provide a lot of insights to governments, to businesses, to public bodies, to give the confidence they need to take the right actions when it comes to the planet and people, and to help drive long-term prosperity. Yeah, we base our decisions, our thoughts, our kind of insights on micro data, which is from consumers, from the business, and not just some thought leadership that we just don't have any data to back it up on. And today, with our amazing experts who have done a lot of work in the space, we'll looking forward to hear their point of view on this alphabet soup that we are in. Okay, Sally, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suresh, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us wherever you might be coming from, right across APAC, which is really wonderful. We found a window that hopefully is somewhat convenient for everybody across the region. So as Suresh mentioned, I'm based in Perth in Western Australia, and here I lead our corporate reputation and also our ESG research practice. And it gives me the chance to work with clients right across the country, the region and the globe. And we get to focus on a really diverse set of different business questions. And it's one of my favorite topics that we're here to talk about today, which is ESG. As Suresh said, it really is starting to be everything, everywhere, all the time. But it can be confusing. Before we do go too much further, I just want to draw your attention to the chat on the platform that we're all watching the webinar on. Please do use it. We'll speak to you for about 40 minutes or so if we keep to time, but we'll definitely leave some time at the end for some discussion. So please feel free to pop any questions into that chat box, or any thoughts, just discussion points. We can certainly circle back to them and have some good discussion at the end. The other thing Suresh mentioned is we have a lot of data to share with you. We're really fortunate at Ipsos with how much information we have to share with the world, as well as our clients directly. There's several reports that I'm going to pull information and insights from today. These are all available to you in full, so we can certainly share all of those with you, and you can search to find them publicly as well. And with these reports I'm going to pull from, as well as focusing on a range of different ESG and business related topics, they also span a range of different audiences. So I'll share some learnings from our inaugural Ipsos ESG Council, which is based on interviews we did earlier this year with chief sustainability officers and other ESG lead roles from major companies right around the globe. So this is those individuals who are right at the coalface of ESG issues and how they're being managed by businesses. We'll also have a look at some information from our Ipsos Reputation Council, which is now in its 14th year. And here we speak to corporate communications and corporate affairs professionals from major corporations around the globe. And if we think, this is a group of people that have been managing ESG issues for decades, and they've witnessed what's happened in the last few years, which is that formalization of ESG. And we'll also pull from just a couple of what are dozens and dozens and dozens of studies that Ipsos releases every year focused on the global and APAC public. So a couple we'll look at in my section will be the Trustworthiness Monitor and also some info from our latest Global Trends report. Now, we did, of course, call today making sense of the alphabet soup. And if we take a look here at just some of the elements related to reporting and disclosure standards when it comes to ESG globally, we can start to see why some people call it alphabet soup. There's a lot of acronyms and initialisms which we can get lost in. And this slide is actually a starting point we often use with clients when we're conducting materiality assessments for them. So that's helping them really understand which ESG issues are material to their business, so which ones matter the most and therefore where they should focus their efforts and their resources. And this is often ahead of then developing really detailed and well-informed ESG and sustainability plans, and it also informs their reporting and disclosure as well. And one of the most common challenges we hear from clients when we're working with them on ESG issues is that it can feel like they're now managing a wholly new set of expectations. So it's actually quite comforting to take a look at some other data to remind ourselves that while the formalization of ESG is new and it's rapidly changing in the region and right across the world, the concepts that sit behind ESG are not new. They've mattered to citizens and to consumers and to other stakeholders for a really long time. And what we're looking at here is data from another one of our studies. This is our What Worries the World series, where we've been asking people, I think here it's 29 different countries for 9 years, this data set here is, we asked them what worries them most. And the issues that rise to the top, they're very much related to ESG. And if we have a look at a couple there, so inflation and the cost of living links directly to the G in ESG, to governance. So that's around consumer pricing decisions and how we manage corporate profit. Poverty and social inequality linked to the S in ESG, so how do businesses align with and actually work to support social causes and help address inequality directly. Financial corruption linked to governance, anti-corruption and bribery behaviours, really strong supply chain management processes. Unemployment, potentially that most foundational expectation we have of business to provide secure long-term employment, and that has that strong link to the S. The E is certainly covered. Climate change comes in within the top 10 across the globe and also here in APAC. But it's also worth noting we're not significantly different here in APAC. There are a couple of differences that Jane will go into in a few minutes' time. But broadly, there's a lot of alignment in what matters across the globe. There may be some differences in the exact order. So while we can see that the issues that sit behind ESG aren't necessarily new, we do need to acknowledge that we exist in difficult times. We exist in the time of the poly crisis. The term poly crisis, it came up a lot at Davos at the World Economic Forum meeting earlier this year, and it really refers to that convergence of multiple crises which are impacting the world at the moment. So that's everything from continued social unrest through to the really fast evolving situation of conflicts around the world, uncertainty about the impact of globalization, the ongoing impact and management of climate change, inflation and cost of living, low trust in government and institutions. There are many of these all converging, and the impact together is much more than they are individually. What we also got from Davos this year was quite an interesting analogy for how to navigate the poly crisis. So it was said that the poly crisis could be seen as like riding a bicycle, or navigating the crisis could be seen as like riding a bicycle, in that a bicycle is inherently unstable. It should fall over, and if it does, you'll get hurt. but if you can learn how to ride it, it could be seen as God's gift. That was the quote that came out of Davos. And it is helpful in that the context we're all operating in and trying to manage businesses in is the poly crisis, and that's making the world inherently unstable. And we, as business leaders, have that challenge of learning how to navigate the poly crisis. And ESG is a key part of that. What's more, against this landscape, we're also seeing what we could call a democratic deficit or a diminished capacity or ability of government to actually help us all through these really difficult and challenging times. And we can see here 70% of citizens across APAC feel that their government is going to do too little in the years ahead to help people navigate these really difficult circumstances. And so increasingly we do find that this gap is being filled by business and the private sector. And this increased role for business would probably see Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize winning Milton Friedman, rolling in his grave, because he was very famous in the 70s for saying, and has lived on through business theory for what he said in the 70s, which is the only social purpose of a business is to increase profit for shareholders. He saw no further role for business in society. 5 decades on, we certainly find ourselves in a different era of capitalism, where not only do we hold businesses responsible for their impact on people and planet, but we do see that clear role for business in society. And we can summarise this shift that we've seen in terms of expectations for business. It can be useful to look at it through a lens of trust. We do a lot of work in this space, and what we've found is 3 clear components to trust when it comes to businesses looking to build and cement and keep trust. And that first piece is foundational, and it's probably existed as long as commerce has existed, and that's that expectation at a very basic level to be competent, to deliver good products and services at a fair price. This then evolved into what could be seen, as including a commitment to do things better, which ultimately means do no harm in the process of delivering those goods and services. The final evolution of that, which we're seeing more and more today and really does feed into the rise of ESG, or maybe is fed by the rise of ESG, is that expectation among some for business to show that it actually shares the interests of its stakeholders, and when times get difficult, it's willing to stand up for those shared interests. And delivering on these 3 elements of trust really, for some businesses, can require a shift or an evolution in how they think, how they behave, and how they actually communicate as well. In good news though, majority of people across the world and here in APAC do feel that business can strike a balance. So here we can see 81% feel that business can do good, but also make a profit at the same time, which is reassuring. And really this is the goal of ESG, where companies can do good for themselves whilst also doing good for people and planet. This of course brings risk. And one of those risks stems from the fact that business leaders aren't necessarily trusted. Here we can see it's just 39% of people across APAC that trust business leaders to tell the truth. Just as a quick aside, we have a lot of data on trust. We can't go into all of it today. We've touched on a little bit. If you do have an interest in trust in your business, please reach out. It's one of our other favourite subjects to talk about, so if it is of interest, do let us know. But back to why trust matters in the context of ESG, it means we can't assume that if we communicate to our customers and other stakeholders about the good things we're doing, we can't assume we'll be believed. So on the one hand, we've got these rising expectations of business, and on the other hand, we've got this really challenging environment to try and deliver against those expectations. Maybe there's good reason for this challenging environment. And here we're looking at data from our Reputation Council members. So that's corporate affairs and corporate comms leaders from right around the globe. And that's people like you who are on the inside of some of the biggest companies in the world. And while they tell us they do agree broadly that there is a clear role for business to play in addressing social issues, 72% of them tell us that they see too many businesses using that language of corporate purpose without then following through and committing and actually enacting real change. And what this is in reality, this is corporate greenwashing and workwashing. And this is arguably one of those greatest risks around ESG. And it's not just a reputational risk, it's a legal risk to business as well. And actually, the latest evolution of this whitewashing and greenwashing is what we're seeing as green hushing, where businesses are doing really good things, in particularly around environmental action, but they choose not to talk about it for fear of being accused of greenwashing. Another useful way of looking at ESG is around it potentially being the execution of corporate purpose. And linking ESG to corporate purpose is helpful because most of us are usually pretty comfortable with the idea of purpose. And we could say that if purpose is that North Star that's meant to guide decisions across businesses at an everyday level, ESG can be seen as the criteria against which businesses can be assessed and held to account for those decisions that they do make every day. And what we can layer in here is the view of chief sustainability officers and other ESG leads from global companies. So this is from our ESG Council report released earlier this year. And we can flesh out more of what they're seeing. And the fact that these roles exist in some of the biggest companies in the world is that clear indication of the importance of ESG. It's a new C-suite level role that is emerging. So what did they tell us? They told us that they are seeing, and the language here really matters, they're seeing fundamental changes to how businesses operate because of ESG. Not small changes, not shifts, not evolutions and building in of new thinking. It's a fundamental shift that they're talking about seeing. And this really talks about principles being embedded from the very top in all levels of strategy and playing out across businesses horizontally. And really they spoke to the role of every individual in a business to help build towards good ESG performance. They also spoke about institutional investors who are maybe seen by some as where ESG started. They're still making their decisions based on ESG performance, so access to capital being driven by ESG performance. And finally, they told us ESG performance is impacting employer brand, and it can be an incredibly valuable tool when done well in the ongoing war for talent, which we all face. So that was a quick run through of ESG landscape. And the final thing I want to touch on before I hand on to Jane is something else we hear frequently from our clients around ESG. And that's how incredibly difficult it can be to prioritise. So you might have an understanding of the broad issues that matter to you and your business, but how do you prioritise where you do put those efforts? What we find is that action is often based around what businesses think their stakeholders, whether that's consumers or other stakeholders, what they think they actually expect of them. And because of this, many businesses tend to err towards environmental action because it's seen by some as being the biggest area to address. Actually, when we do ask people though, and what we've got here is data from 4,500 people across APAC, when we ask them what is the most important area for multinational companies to address, we see it's actually social issues in the purple there at 43% that comes to the top as being the priority. They're certainly spread, but at an overall level, social issues are seen as what should be the biggest focus of business. But so much of the discussion around ESG focuses on the E, and Jane will go into even more detail on that in a few minutes' time. What we do also know, though, is that the weighting across the E, the S and the G differs considerably by industry, and it also differs by region. We are different here in APAC. The results are different here compared to the global average. Have a quick look. We're going to have a quick look at a few industries just to see what is expected of them to focus on. We'll start with automotive. And we can see here the action that people across APAC generally want to see from the automotive industry. It's centred around safety and emissions, as well as affordability and accessibility of new forms of transport. So these expectations in the top 6, spanning the E, the S and the G. We can compare that to food and beverage. Here we can see safety is actually the #1 expectation again. This is followed then by a focus on sustainable packaging, and then 3 social elements come through for food and beverage, so consumer health, employee health and safety, and also job creation. Compare that then to financial services, lots of orange, so a strong focus on governance from the APAC public for the fin services sector. So that's everything from combating crime and corruption, executive remuneration, and how we deal with government. Oil and gas, as we might expect, is dominated by environmental concerns, so helping and investing in that shift to renewables, as well as reducing emissions across operations. Rounding out the industries we have is tech. And here we can see a focus on social and governance that comes through, so cyber security and also protecting the data and privacy of internet users. So we do get a lot of variation. If we look at these industries overall, there is quite a bit of orange for APAC. That was something that came through strongly, that focus on governance, as well as a focus on social impact. And we see a lot of variation across sectors, which really highlights that importance of having a deep understanding of what is expected by your stakeholders of you. And there'll also be a difference about specific companies within those sectors. So it's layer upon layer. The other thing to note is that the expectations here are pretty well aligned with the core business of each sector. We didn't see things in there that required business to really stray too far from their lane in order to meet ESG expectations. And of course, the corporate landscape is littered with companies that haven't listened to stakeholder expectations before building and acting on ESG strategy. And they're left in that very uncomfortable position of getting it wrong. And as this Reputation Council member said very succinctly, when it comes to ESG and sustainability action, it has to be relevant, it has to be in context, and it has to be rooted in action. So one of the final things I'll show you is just the framework we use with our clients when we do work with them on developing that strategy and initiatives. And it really is based around 3 key questions. The first one there is around asking yourself that question of, is the issue we're choosing to focus on salient to our company? Will action here be seen as authentic, or could we be seen as jumping on a bandwagon? And doing something that is inherently aligned with your business and is a win-win, it means you're much less likely to be accused of those things like greenwashing and being woke. The second element there in the question there is, do we have the credibility to act in this space, and do we have a convincing story to tell? And companies can't always assume that they are a credible actor in the space that they want to go into. And oftentimes this actually means partnering with NGOs or those potentially in the scientific space to borrow equity from them. And the final piece is around actually taking action. Are we walking the talk and being effective in what we actually set out to do? So just a quick roundup before I hand over to Jane, hopefully 4 useful principles for you to take with you. Firstly, that those issues behind ESG are not new. They've mattered for a long time, but what is new is that second point there, the expectation of business to actually play a role in addressing these issues, which brings both risk and reward. Thirdly there, and reassuringly, is that expectations are really closely aligned with core business. So you can meet ESG obligations by doing what you do well. And then finally, that lens around authenticity, credibility, and being effective in what you set out to do should ideally get you to that sweet spot where it also makes ESG action more sustainable well into the future. I'll hand over now to Jane, who's going to dive a bit deeper on a consumer lens.
So thank you, Sally. Really interesting insights there. What I'm going to do now is quickly look at things through consumer voice and what the consumers themselves are telling us specifically. And Sally shared this chart earlier on, which I think is a really nice grounding of the global and APAC worries and what's worrying people about their countries at the moment. However, I think there is one really critical data point missing, which is the data point for climate change. So here we can see in climate change in Asia Pacific, 23% of people have said that this is one of their top 3 worries. And it comes out as the 6th rank importance, whereas globally that is only at 7, it's ranked number 7 and at 18%. So clearly this is an area where in Asia Pacific we really are quite concerned about climate change. So I want to dive a little bit deeper into what that actually means. So when we ask our respondents and our consumers, when we think about sustainability, what are the top issues that you associate with sustainability? We see that nearly all of the top measures are environment related. Things from such as industries that are resilient and not damaging the environment, clean energy, looking after our oceans and water, tackling climate change and so on. The lower down part, the lower associations are around social and governance. So clearly it's the environment that's coming through. But as Sally said, and as we've seen in further data as well, we know that actually when it comes to action, people are actually looking more for the social and governance actions to be taken, not necessarily the environment. When we talk about the environment and we ask people whether or not they agree or disagree with these different statements, one of the core statements is about heading for an environment disaster unless we change our habits quickly. And you can see that across the whole region, in every market, it's a really high priority. Nearly everyone is agreeing that we have to start changing our habits or there will be an environmental disaster. So we know that they're thinking about sustainability in terms of environment. We're expecting an environmental catastrophe to happen, and we know that the climate change and environment is much higher for consumers in APAC as a worry and something that needs to be addressed. So let's hear directly from some of our respondents, some of our consumers. We've asked them to think about ESG and to think about what it means to them and what behaviours they think will be most important and appropriate to combating.
ก็ถ้าอย่างที่เราเห็นกันเนาะก็จะเป็นที่ผมคอนเซิร์นเลยก็จะเป็นเรื่อง PM 2.5 ครับก็อยากจะรณรงค์ให้ใครหลายๆคนเนาะมาใช้การขนส่งสาธารณะให้มากขึ้นนะครับอย่างเช่นถ้าเข้าไปในตัวเมืองเนาะอาจจะไม่ต้องใช้รถยนต์อาจจะนั่งรถไฟฟ้าแทนอะไรอย่างเงี้ยนะครับ
ถ้าจะเอาเป็นเบสิกเลยก็น่าจะที่คนพูดถึงกันทั่วโลกแล้วก็พยายามจะรณรงค์กันก็คือปัญหาโลกร้อนหรือ climate change เพราะอะไรเพราะว่าอาจจะมาจากการที่เราทำกิจกรรมทางเศรษฐกิจอย่างเช่นอุตสาหกรรมนู่นนี่นั่นเยอะแยะแล้วก็ปล่อยคาร์บอนไดออกไซด์ออกไปอะไรอย่างเงี้ยคำถามคือเราช่วยอะไรได้บ้างกลับมาที่ตัวเราก่อน personally ถ้าถามว่าช่วยอะไรได้บ้างง่ายๆเลยคือจะลดวิธีลดโลกร้อนในบ้านของเราได้ยังไงอย่างเช่นอาจจะใช้วัสดุที่ลดการทำลายสิ่งแวดล้อมง่ายๆเลยถุงผ้าเบสิกมากอะไรที่อยู่ใกล้ๆตัวเราก็สามารถเริ่มได้ถุงผ้าหรือแม้กระทั่งการประหยัดไฟอย่างเช่นแทนที่เราเดินออกจากห้องแทนที่จะเสียบปลั๊กพัดลมไว้ปกติเนาะแล้วก็ถอดมันซะหรือสายชาร์จโทรศัพท์แบบนี้แทนที่จะเสียบค้างไว้ให้มันกินไฟให้มันกินนู่นนี่นั่นแล้วก็ถอดอะไรเงี้ยคิดว่าน่าจะเริ่มจากสิ่งเล็กๆน้อยๆก่อนน่าจะเป็นเบสิก
Food waste. Proper storage to extend the shelf life and do not buy items that might take longer for you to consume.
やっぱり私が一番気になっているのは地球温暖化かなと思ってましてやっぱ全世界地球規模のやっぱりレベルの問題なのでそれが改善されないことには今後地球上で生きていくことが難しいんじゃないのかなと思ってます、改善策としてはやっぱり今すごい、私自身が先進国にいるせいもありますけれどもちょっと昔というか少し不便でもその地球のことを考えて行動していくっていうことが大事なんじゃないのかなって思ってます。わかります。
The biggest environmental problems that we have today includes climate change as well as pollution. Now, how we are going to fix it? It requires a behavioral change as well as a consciousness about these issues and how it's going to affect our future lives. We also need to have a sounding decision on how we are about to consume on daily lives, such as our choices of public transportation and also what kind of things that we consume on a daily basis, our waste management. So with doing these choices in behavioral day-to-day lives will also help to mitigate this climate and environmental risk in the future.
A lot of this is really interesting because even though we haven't prompted people to think specifically about one E, S or G, when they naturally talk about things, they automatically come to the environment and they automatically come to personal responsibility. Everyone in that snippets that we saw is talking about the work that they need to do as an individual to combat climate change. But then quite often what we will see is that people overestimate what impact their personal behaviour can have on climate change as a whole. So we presented consumers and people with a list of statements and actions that people can take to address climate change and to which they think will have the biggest impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see here what came out top. Straight away, people are talking about renewable energy. They're talking about recycling. They're talking about cooking. We are in Asia. Cooking is absolutely critical and crucial to life. We're talking about less packaging, we're talking about public transport. Lower down the list, far lower down the list, are elements like turning to veganism and not consuming meat products or dairy products and so on. But then you have the indices on the right-hand side, and these numbers represent the true impact that these different measures will have on greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see that there's actually quite a big gap between what we personally think we need to do, such as recycling, and what the reality is. So recycling for us was second most important. It's going to have the biggest impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Where actually in the full list of reality, it's coming way down at the 60th position. Same with packaging, the same with growing or producing your own food. If we were to extend this list, living car-free is by far the most impactful that you're going to have, followed closely by veganism and eliminating meat and dairy products from your diets. So there's actually quite a big gap between what we think we can do and what we can actually do. And it's not to complain at consumers, because we're doing what we think is going to do, and doing something is better than doing nothing. And we know that no two people are the same. We all like to think we're unique. So what we have done is we've run a segmentation analysis over the last 2 years. Actually, we ran the first round in February last year, and we ran it again in the middle of this year, to look at how different actions and different behaviors are manifesting in different groups of people. This segmentation, there's a full paper available that we can share that will tell you everything you need to know. And also there's a typing tool available that can be put into any kind of research project, should you be interested in understanding how your consumer and your target feel about the environment, so you can communicate in different ways as well. So let's just look at the extreme ends of this segmentation. So at the top end, we have the activists, and they're sitting right at the top of our scale, which is on the level of concern on the horizontal axis, and the activity and engagement level on the vertical axis. And so these activists are truly, truly engaged. They are so panicked and worried about what is happening in the world, and they will go out of their way to make significant changes. I like to think of these as like the Greta Thunbergs of the world, right? They're really active, they really want to drive change. And then at the other end, you have the disengaged denialists. These are the people who either believe that the whole idea of climate change and environmental catastrophe has been overblown, it's not as urgent as people think, or that it's just too late. So there's no point in us doing anything because it's just too late, we're beyond the path of redemption. Let's just break down these three in the middle a little bit further. We have the pragmatists. These are the segment of people who know there's an issue, they know they need to do something, but they're not going to go out and change everything about their behaviors. They're going to do the easy, most convenient, easy to handle changes in their lives. They might pay a little bit more for a sustainable product or recycling. They might pay for that extra tote bag instead of using plastic, but they're not going to go and do everything. They're going to do something. Then we have the conflicted contributors. These are people who know, again, there's an issue, but unfortunately, finances come first. Okay, we're going to pay for things. I'm not going to pay extra for all of these things. I'm focused more on what I need to consume, what I need to do to continue to survive. I'm not going to pay extra. I'm not going to do anything extra beyond what I can. And then we have the busy bystanders. And these are the people who, yeah, accept that there's a challenge, but it's way down the list. There are so many other problems and priorities that exist, whether it's the cost of entry, being sustainable and environmentally friendly is just going to cost me a lot more money. It's really inconvenient. I'm not going to remember to take my tote bags to the supermarket every week. That's not in my natural behavior and how I work. So they're just not prioritizing. And I think this sort of a little bit reflects where climate change often falls. On our What Worries the World chart that both Sally and I showed, climate change is pretty consistently there. However, it will be overtaken if there's a rise in conflict or a pandemic suddenly erupts, or if those things disappear, climate change becomes a little bit more important. So it's always there, but it's never seen as the topmost priority. It's just something that's sizzling down in people's back of mind. But what's most interesting for me about this is the shift in segment sizes that we've had since we ran this twice. So we have noticed just in 18 months that the size of the segment of pragmatists, so those are the people who are willing to make changes, has actually massively reduced from 29 to 23%. And the busy bystanders, those that have identified so many other priorities that need their focus and attention, has increased to 21%. So there's definitely a shifting attitudes and a shifting in behavior. And as brands and businesses, it's important for us to understand where our consumers are sitting so that we're talking the right game, that we're saying the right things. So that's a lot about consumer on environment and what we need to do in the environment. Let's now go and have a look at what people have said when we think about social and governance and business and what the role of business can do.
Okay, I think in our opinion, the biggest challenges for businesses to actually practice good corporate governance would definitely be probably like the resistance from leadership or probably from stakeholders. Or maybe it's like more in terms of the conflict of interest, where I think when you talk about leadership and shareholders, what they want is probably short-term gains, as compared to like maybe what the public wants is looking into like sustainability issues in a long-term basis. So I think this could probably cause an impact into how leadership make decisions, which will actually in jeopardize of like good corporate governance practices.
โอเคก็เริ่มที่องค์กรนะครับก็เรื่องของพนักงานจะต้องให้โอกาสทุกคนโอเคต้องดูความสามารถแต่ในความสามารถที่เท่าเทียมกันต้องไม่มีความลำเอียงในเรื่องของเพศในเรื่องของพื้นฐานครอบครัวชนชั้นอะไรเงี้ยนะครับก็นั่นคือเริ่มที่องค์กรนะครับในเรื่องของสินค้าก็พยายามผลิตสินค้าสมมติในประเภทเดียวกันเนี่ยพยายามให้ทุกคนเข้าถึงได้นะครับเช่นคนพิการหรือคนรายได้น้อยรายได้สูงพยายามแบ่งแยกให้น้อยที่สุดให้เท่าเทียมกันมากที่สุดมีตัวเลือกของราคาที่หลากหลายที่ทำให้คนทุกชนชั้นสามารถที่จะเข้าถึงใช้อรรถประโยชน์ของสินค้าของเราได้อะไรอย่างนี้เป็นต้น
The presence of microplastics in the ocean and other bodies of water, the best thing we can do about it is to legislate to ban and to use recyclable materials.
I know that businesses can help the society to be more fair and inclusive to everyone by first having stances on certain social issues that we have in our community these days, because I know that businesses as well have that kind of big platform to show their influence to everyone. And aside from that, businesses can also help or support certain causes that have helpful purposes in our community as well.
So again, we can see that consumers do have an expectation of business and government to do something. And this isn't really surprising. We've got data here to support it as well. When we ask people, the groups and individuals they think that need to act and those that are actually acting. And straight away, what you'll see is that the only organizations that are actually exceeding expectations are scientists and NGOs or non-profits. Everyone else is failing to meet expectations of the general public. In particular, governments, and that's global, national governments as well as local governments. You can see there's a big gap, 61 to 41. But there's also private companies and a gap with private companies, and what we're doing are the expectations for us is that 37% think we need to act, but only 27% think we are actually acting. So there's a big role, a big gap to close there. And you might be thinking, well, so what? What does it actually mean? Is it going to make any impact to us? So I very, very quickly want to finish by talking about a pilot that we ran out of the UK for our ESG brand tracking solution. So we were looking at sustainability and sustainability index across fast food chains with a focus primarily on McDonald's. So when we look here at people when we ask people about their knowledge of ESG activities, so are you aware of the activities that these brands are doing? McDonald's on the don't know, so I don't know what they're doing, is really low compared to the category, meaning that they are communicating well so that people do know what they're doing, they are behaving. Does it have an impact? Yes, it does. If we then look at their brand desire score and the sustainability index, you can see that both are much higher than anyone else. So communicating about this ESG work that we're doing can have a huge impact on the brand desire and the need to take up. It shouldn't necessarily be the only message. It needs to be tied with a co-benefit, another idea and another benefit of a product, but there's definitely some advantage. And the final piece of R&D that I want to share with you today is our latest thinking on how to make successful brands. We know from research that brands can grow if they shape and meet expectations, if they look and consider the context that people are living in, and if they're acting with empathy. And I just want to quickly say the context. All of the data that Sally and myself have shared so far is the context that people are living in. It's the environment, sustainable, social, all the governance, everything is the context that they're living in. Whether that's micro, what's happening to me on a personal level, or whether that's macro, what's happening to the country or the world around me, they will all have an impact on the brands that we choose. So we absolutely should be aware and taking into account the context that people are living in. So I'm going to hand over to Kieran, who's going to wrap up with a nice what this all means for us.
Thanks, Jane. Good afternoon, good morning. Now I will share on how to build, activate, and monitor your ESG strategy. As Sally and Jane has just shared, ESG is very broad and it covers many dimensions. So it can be a bit daunting and challenging to understand where to start, how to activate it, how to monitor it, and how to prove to your stakeholders, especially your bosses, that you are indeed spending good money in terms of prioritizing your ESG activities and so on, right? So some of the questions we typically get from our clients include, for example, how do we start? How do we align our priorities versus the internal and external stakeholders? Sometimes they are not in the same page. How do we compare against our competitors? Are we doing too much, too little? Are our activities giving the right ROI? What's the economic impact of our ESG activities, right? And how do we measure our brand uplift from our ESG activities versus our normal regular marketing and so on? So these are very practical and indeed important questions to consider as you begin your ESG journey. So over the last 36 months or so, we have developed a set of solutions or toolkit to answer these questions. Yeah, I will not go through each one of them line by line, but I would like to assure you it covers your end-to-end journey. For example, how you design your ESG strategy, how do you activate it, monitor it, and finally, understanding the economic impact of your ESG initiatives. Our ESG solutions are designed for you to do good while outperforming the market, because at the end of the day, you still have a business to run and you still want to make sure that that investments are done both to do good and also to do well. So for example, our Ipsos ESG valuation methodology assesses the economic value generated by ESG investments and identifies strategic investment priorities and opportunities to optimize financial returns. One of the more common questions we get is, what is the actual brand uplift or the brand equity, the increase in brand equity from our ESG activities versus our regular brand marketing activities? So it's not an easy answer to address, because sometimes they overlap, right, as what Jane and Sally has mentioned. So what we have done is we have managed to come up with a model to isolate the impact of ESG on brand activity from other marketing activities. Let me go to the next slide. Yep. So the final output provides clear evidence of the economic value generated by ESG investments, how to optimize financial returns, and where should we prioritize our investments. I would like to end by saying that whether you need information, advice, or technical support, Ipsos has the necessary solutions and experience to support you. So feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be more than happy to have a discussion. Thank you. Next, we'll go to our Q&A section. I believe we have a couple of questions coming in. Let me read them. The first question is, how do we communicate genuine ESG initiatives to our consumers and who are skeptical of greenwashing? Perhaps, Sally, you can address them.
Thank you. And do keep any other questions coming in. It's always one of the most fun parts. It comes back to that authenticity. You know, I think we can all think about examples, and we intentionally didn't put them up today, but there are a lot of really high profile examples where companies have, if we give the benefit of the doubt, they've undertaken activity that they thought was going to be good. And that would be a mix of things, and that there was an anticipation of helping to address the genuine challenge across society, and also that it would be good for their brand. You know, they went into it with good expectations and with goodwill. But where we've seen really high profile examples of it going wrong is when the alignment isn't there. So it's an issue that either they haven't done the groundwork to really understand amongst their very different stakeholders, where do they all sit on this issue. So starting with that information, and that's not to say you only focus on an issue that external stakeholders tell you they also care about, but you take that into consideration. But you also look at who you are as a business and what matters to you, and what is your purpose, and what do you stand for, and what is your core business, and what do your people care about. And if you take all of those inputs, and also where can you have a genuine impact and actually do good, you know, as opposed to writing a check for an NGO, where can you use your skills and abilities and unique capabilities as a business, whether that's your voice, it's your supply chain, it's your actual value chain, where can you make a difference? If you get all those things right and you communicate it genuinely, and you also have your business ready to stay the course, that you're taking this decision for the right reason, it's much less likely to go wrong. One high profile example is Nike and the position they took very, very strongly around Black Lives Matter and their partnership with Colin Kaepernick. You know, they made a decision. We've got some really good case study on it, but they put all the right inputs in and they made the decision for the right reason, and they stayed the course. You know, they did have people burning their shoes in the street. They had people boycotting their brand, but they knew that across their stakeholder base and their people and who they are as a business, it was the right decision to take. And they stayed the course, and arguably they've come out better for it. We've got data that shows they did come out better for it. But that's a very high profile and probably errs into corporate activism more so than pure ESG activity. But if the alignment's right, you're doing it for the right reason, it's really hard to get that criticism of greenwashing. But if you don't do it right, that's when it's much more easy to be criticized.
Thanks, Sally. Surely companies know that greenwashing is something which is not acceptable at all by the consumers and also the regulators, right? Do you see companies are being more aware that they should not be doing greenwashing, or they should be true to their cause? Do you see that happening now more often than before?
Absolutely, and I imagine everyone on this call to varying degrees will have much closer relationships with legal than they ever did before, because greenwashing has legal implications. And, you know, we'll do comms testing for clients where legal is part of that. It's not often that legal gets involved in research, but nowadays they do, because the claims that want to be made, we want claims that are resonating with the public and that are going to get you traction and cut through and have strong brand impact, but they've got to be to within a letter of the law. In terms of greenwashing, is your claim a step beyond, a millimetre beyond what you're actually doing, or is there any room for that to be scrutinised? So it's a very real shift, and arguably why there is that rise of the Chief Sustainability Officer, because these issues have material impacts, legal impacts, as well as brand and reputation impacts. So it is incredibly topical and top of mind for clients. And it also comes back to, that green hushing that we spoke about. So there's a lot of companies doing good things and saying, we're staying quiet because we don't want to misstep. We'd rather not get any benefit from it, just do it quietly. There is a middle ground, but it's tricky and it requires a lot of nuance.
Thanks, Sally. That was very insightful. So Jane, maybe the next one to you. As you know, I work a lot with industrial clients, B2B, cement and industrial products and so on. And perhaps some of them are not so advanced. Their journey is still at the infancy stage compared to, say, McDonald's and so on. So some of them do not have any ESG function in place at the moment, or they're just beginning to start a journey. What advice would you have for them? Are they too late? How should they go about doing it?
I think it's interesting, and it's probably relevant for most companies, like smaller businesses, right? Where are we at and what do we need to do here? And my personal feeling is that the first thing we need to do, and the priority should always be to know your consumer and know what their expectations are. I also, I mean, for me personally, I feel like you should be doing good because you want to do good, not because it's going to check a box on a tick sheet of actions that business has taken. So understanding the consumer, your consumer, what they want to achieve and what they associate with ESG to give you a good starting point. And it doesn't have to be an enormous program like the one Sally just talked about with Nike. There are loads going on. As Sally said, there's loads of examples of this. It can just be little things like saying, we're not going to have plastic straws. We're also not going to have the rubbish paper straws that disintegrate when you drink your drink, but we're not going to have plastic straws available to us anymore. You don't have to have a big, bold communication strategy that talks about that. It can just be something that's minor, small, noticeable, and it will be picked up by people. You know, when you're given a plastic straw in places now, it's odd. It feels weird to be given a plastic straw. So I think knowing what your business can do, knowing what the size of your business can do, but also knowing what your consumer is expecting or would expect from your business alone. You know, we're not expecting everyone to go out and suddenly change the world. You know, small steps. Small steps.
So I'm going to ask you a question which I know is very difficult to answer, but how expensive is it to have an ESG strategy? You know what I mean? Is it going to be expensive?
Well. Thanks, Kieran. I don't personally, I think it's as expensive as you want it to be. Not everyone is going to have a Nike style budget or a Bud Light budget. There's a big example with Bud Light happening right in the US at the moment. And not everyone's going to have that size of budget, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything. A smaller budget can make a big difference as well. And it's just the way that you share, the way that you talk about it. It's hard to put a number on it, but Sally, you're more close to the corporate world.
I think you'll flip the question, which is not meant to be a politician's answer, but how expensive is it to not have an ESG strategy? And that, I think, would answer the question for most businesses, that if you don't and you fall foul, it will lead to material impacts on the bottom line. And the flip as well, ESG done really well when it is aligned with your core business, creates growth and new business opportunities. You know, there's a whole world of purpose-driven organizations that are incredibly profitable, you know, the likes of the very well-trod, you know, brought out examples with Unilever. Their sustainable brands are their most successful brands. You look at all in Dove or Ben & Jerry's, and then you look at the likes of Patagonia, and they're again sort of some of those purpose-driven, but even just reducing risk is good for the bottom line. So you're investing in reducing risk by having a strong ESG strategy. So you're clearly a proponent, and yeah, would flip the question, what's the risk that you might pay for not having one?
So if I'm hearing correctly, that you don't have to save the world, but you can do some small things things where you can influence directly, right? And that can be as big as small as the limitations you have. So
and I
recently,
think just to add, Kieran, I was going to say, like, if you listen to some of the consumer feedback that we had and some of the things that they were saying, all anyone is trying to do is take baby steps to feel like they're doing something. So yes, of course, we want businesses to act and we want governments to act, but we are doing baby steps. So let's have businesses at least showing that they're doing baby steps as well. Everyone is trying to explore the world in this space.
So I recently did a similar ESG web seminar in Thailand, and one of the participants came to me and asked me, hey, he's been hearing that ESG is becoming taboo in certain circles, and some companies are staying away from advocating that they are actually championing ESG, right? Some have called it woke activism, you know, it's been associated with woke and so on. It's in some circles, ESG is a bad word, right? What is your take on that?
I'll jump first if you don't mind, Jane. I think another piece that is really clear as well, and even amongst B2B audiences, ESG is a bit of a redundant term and it's not well understood, doesn't stand for a lot on its own. It can be easily misinterpreted. And as you said, it is now being tied to, particularly in the US, a pushback against taking into consideration a broad set of stakeholder needs. And that, you know, there was examples of Coke being called Woca-Cola because of the activity it was taken, but they're an organisation, disclaimer, who we work really closely with, but they are intensely invested in managing the negative impacts of their business and using their scale to do good. And I think it's very hard to argue with those things that it's doing. So I would say it comes again, you know, the action itself might change, but this is where communication becomes more important than action. It's how you position it with different stakeholders. And if those of you in roles we've got multi-stakeholders, how you speak about this activity that your business is doing to government will be different to how you talk about it to the investment market, will be different to how you talk about it to your employees internally, but ideally the right action's being taken. So I think the way to get around that pushback is to, again, to go back and ask yourself as a business, why are we doing what we're doing? Are we doing it to win favour? Are we doing it to put a label on our new packaging to say we're doing something? Or, you know, in the case of Mondelez and Cocoa Life, that action was taken because there was a supply chain issue around cocoa beans. So they created the incredible Cocoa Life program. Again, disclosure, we work closely with them on that program. But that whole program has led to a more sustainable supply chain of cocoa beans, having material impacts in cocoa farming communities around the globe and the flow-on social and economic benefits that come from that. So it's very hard to argue against effective action. So that would be how to get around it.
What about you, Jane?
Excuse me. I really just think at the moment, the thing that drives me with what Sally was saying there is actually it comes down to just being a good business and trying to recruit talent, right? You're not going to recruit talent into your business if you're not equal, if you're not providing good social support or, you know, looking after the poor or trying to save the environment, because it is such a critical part of everyone's lives, right? So it's a part of the recruitment process as well to be able to stand for something and know something. But also when it comes to talking about it, I really feel like we don't have to talk about ESG. We use the phrase, we use the terminology because it encompasses something that we can, you know, part of the alphabet soup, right? We can talk about ESG as everything. But saying that you're giving a donation to charity, you're not talking ESG, you are talking social behavior and being good to the people around you and supporting people around you. So I think it's really important that we have that strategy, that we have that conversation, that we have that legs to stand on for the future of our business, not just for people buying us, but with also people wanting to work with us. But we don't have to say we have an ESG strategy, we have a giving back to the community strategy, or we have an environmental policy, those kind of things, which will resonate more with the consumer as well.
Thanks so much. I think we're just about to run out of time. It's really about 1:30, close to 1:30. I'd like to thank Jane and Sally and also the organizers at Ipsos for putting this webinar on track. And I'd like to thank all the attendees who have joined us today from their busy schedule. And should you need any other further information, you know, our deck or any other information, feel free to reach any one of us or the broader Ipsos team. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.